We're going to be looking at the economic policies of Mrs. Thatcher's Conservative Government from 1979 and the impact that they had on the United Kingdom as a whole. Now, we already know that in 1979 Mrs. Thatcher had different plans for the economy to those that had gone before. This was all about the end to the consensus that had existed in British politics and economic management since the end of the Second World War. Now, Mrs. Thatcher and the New Right identified a number of problems in the British economy during that period, and she was determined to do something about it. So, for example, she felt that government spending was far too high. She felt that the government interfered too much in the running of the economy and businesses. She felt that the trade unions were far too powerful and militant. And she also identified the fact that British productivity and growth were low, that inflation was rife, that there was a lack of competitiveness in the economy, a lack of entrepreneurial spirit. And she wanted to restore the free market, to get the government out of people's lives, to roll back the state, and to breathe fresh air really into British industry and manufacturing. Now, all of these problems we've seen before in post-war British history, and we've also, you may have identified that Edward Heath from 1970 onwards identified similar problems. The difference being is that Mrs. Thatcher was more determined than Heath was to carry on with these plans, whatever pain it brought the population. Now, the main policy, the central plank of her economic policies, was designed to tackle the problem of inflation, which had been a growing problem in the world economy over the decades, particularly following the oil shock of 1973. And Mrs. Thatcher lent heavily on financial theories proposed by people like Milton Friedman, economists over in the States, in Chicago. And Friedman's argument is that if your economy is going to work properly, inflation, firstly, most importantly, needs bringing under control. And the way to do that was to restrict the amount of money in circulation in the economy, to control and measure too the amount of money swimming around in the economy. If you can clamp down on this, then everything else will work a lot better. So, if you're going to take money out of the economy, if you're going to restrict the amount of money in circulation, there are certain things that you can do. Mrs. Thatcher, firstly, was very keen to cut government spending, which she felt was far too high, something which chimed with her beliefs in budgeting and not spending more than you can afford. Secondly, to keep interest rates high to discourage borrowing. Interest rates went up to 17% in 1979 and were their main mechanism to try and suck money out of the economy, and hopefully that would dampen down inflation. So, monetarism was installed. Unfortunately, however, this did lead to some side effects, and the impact of monetarism and these economic policies were hard felt by many in the UK. Firstly, for example, it caused high levels of unemployment, with interest rates being so high and government spending being cut. Support for industry fell, and as a result of which job losses increased. Fall in orders for manufactured goods, and Britain was pitched into an economic recession as we get to the period around about 1981. Unemployment actually heads up towards 3 million by 1982. Remember that under Heath was shocked when unemployment hit the 1 million mark in the UK back in the early 1970s. Well, we're 3 times this now by 1982, so you can probably understand the uproar that this caused. As well as that also, it did appear that at first these policies were not working. Even though interest rates were incredibly high and public spending was slashed, inflation did initially go up. But over the course of this first Conservative government to 1983, it did come down inflation from 19% in 1979 to 5% in 1983. Unfortunately, growth during this period fell too, as well as unemployment going up. So there were great feelings that this medicine was not working. Similar to Heath back in the early 1970s. Now, this unemployment also contributed towards some of the social unrest during 1981 that occurred in parts of the country, particularly in inner city areas that bore the brunt of the job cuts. For example, in April 1981, you get serious rioting in Brixton in London, and then later on in July, in the summer of 1981, in other parts of the UK, for example, most famously in Toxteth in Liverpool. Now, unemployment and jobs for school leavers, etc., are only part of the problem here. The social unrest had other contributory factors, for example, unhappiness over police discrimination, over young black people being stopped and searched by the police. And there are obviously other factors in there, poor housing, etc. But certainly, poor job prospects caused by the economic policies of Mrs Thatcher's government were a big contributing factor towards the social unrest in 1981. And there was huge opposition to these Conservative policies, the feeling that they were deliberately causing suffering and hardship to the most vulnerable in society, particularly the young in inner cities, and really a feeling that unemployment was skyrocketing and the Conservatives weren't too bothered about that. Their focus was on getting inflation down rather than worrying about some of the side effects of it. Now, there are a couple of good examples of this, of Mrs Thatcher's and the Conservatives' apparent indifference to the plight of the unemployed during this period. For example, in 1980, Mrs Thatcher at a Conservative Party conference made her famous claim that the lady's not for turning, that she was determined and not going to go back on these economic policies like Ted Heath had back in the early 70s. You also have the 1981 conference speech by Norman Tebbit, the Employment Minister, who told delegates at the conference that his father faced unemployment in the 1930s, but he didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he went on looking until he found it. So that lack of sympathy with some of the impact, the social impacts of the policies of monetarism did appear to be warranted, did appear to be grounded in reality. You then have the famous 1981 budget by her Chancellor Geoffrey Howe, which many people felt was an opportunity to rein back some of these monetarist policies, and particularly in the face of popular disapproval with them, and also with members of the Conservative Party who felt that this was damaging to Conservative electoral protests. These are sometimes referred to by Mrs Thatcher as the so-called wets of her cabinet and party. So there was even opposition within the Conservative government, inside the Conservative cabinet, to how hard these policies were. But in the 81 budget, Geoffrey Howe and Mrs Thatcher pressed even further and introduced even stricter monetarist measures and spending measures to control the money supply, and as a result of which to bear down further on inflation, with the worry, of course, that this would cause further hardship for some people. So by the time you get to 1982, the economy is struggling, it is in recession, unemployment is going up, inflation is coming down, growth and manufacturing output are struggling and have been hit hard. And in the opinion polls, Mrs Thatcher is incredibly unpopular, and there are great worries that if there is an election, which there is coming presumably in 1983, that the Conservatives would end up losing it.